Happy New Year! I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome back to Bookends. There's a certain kind of grief that doesn't always get taken seriously in all quarters, even though most of us have gone through it at some point. And that's the grief of a breakup, the end of a romantic relationship. When a person who was your whole world suddenly becomes a stranger to you or just evaporates from your life as if they were never there. They haven't died, but that kind of loss can feel like a sort of death. Zoe Whittall has captured that painful and disorienting feeling in her new book, No Credit River. It's a hybrid of prose poetry, memoir, and autofiction. Zoe actually started her career as a poet, but she's now best known as a novelist. Her books are often frank and funny explorations of queer desire, feelings about motherhood, and anxiety, all things that Zoe has grappled with in her personal life. Earlier this year, Zoe also published her first collection of short stories called Wild Failure. And that book also follows characters as they navigate their way through some fraught relationships and bad decisions, navigating intense longing and the fear of abandonment along the way. Zoe Whittall joined me from her home in Prince Edward County. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, nice to see you.
Thank you so much for joining me. First of all, congratulations. 2 books in 1 year is pretty major.
Thank you.
I feel like for me, reading them back to back, No Credit River and Wild Failure felt a little bit like companion pieces. They're very different, but they also do sort of speak to each other with some common themes. I'm wondering for you, is there a way you understand the connection between them? Do you see these as works that are in conversation with each other?
It's funny. I think it was somewhat inevitable that there would be sort of narrative connections between them. I think every author cannot escape, the genealogy of their life. And though this is the first time, No Credit River is the first time I've actually explicitly wrestled with autobiography as a form. But I did, just by virtue of the fact that I was writing them at the same time, there are thematic preoccupations that sort of emerge for sure.
I want to dive into No Credit River first. And as you said, this was kind of your first dip into the waters of more explicit autobiography in your work. No Credit River tells the story of a failed relationship and its aftermath, and you describe the book in its opening pages as an unreliable memoir in prose poetry. And I was interested in you describing it yourself as unreliable right at the opening. What appealed to you about kind of blurring the line in that way?
The Ars Poetica that starts the book is one of the last things that I wrote. And it felt like I needed to establish some things before the poetry, because it can be so slippery. And I felt like anybody who is writing about a romantic relationship is not going to be telling you facts. They're going to be telling you feelings, and they're going to be going through their experience. And I felt like just laying out that fact at the beginning, because, if people didn't write about heartbreak, we wouldn't have the Fleetwood Mac Rumors album. It's a really universal experience, but it can feel so particular, and it can be so kind of humiliating and embarrassing to write about it and talk about it. But there's this long literary history. And as a reader, I'm obsessed with reading about heartbreak. And, I've always sort of wanted to write, Elizabeth Smart by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept. I've always kind of wanted to write a queer version of that book. And sort of this is what comes close. But this wasn't the kind of book that's like talking badly or trying to expose anything about a relationship. It's really about my own wounds and my own vulnerability and wanting to get to the bottom of mistakes that I've made in relationship. And so with that line, I was kind of trying to point towards that and to admit it.
I'm interested, you mentioned by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept as one work that you maybe were inspired by in putting this together. It definitely feels to me like your work is also very much in conversation with other literary works, sometimes name-checking things. You have this epigraph from the poet Eileen Myles. You mentioned Kathy Acker, Nadine Gordenberg in your work. I'm wondering, who are some of the sort of like literary forebears that you found yourself maybe drawing on a bit? And what does it feel like to put your work in a lineage in that way?
So I feel like I've always been the kind of writer, even when I'm writing fiction, I'm always really conscious of the fact that books are in conversation with each other. And I come from a very specific school of queer writing that is kind of by nature a little bit confessional, a little bit of intertextual. And so this book was very inspired formally by Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, Mary Ruefle, Charles Simic, Jenny Offel, Sarah Manguso, like writers that are really concerned with the fragment and the long line. And the book was also really inspired by the new narrative movement, which was, a poetic movement that emerged in the 70s in San Francisco. And it sort of was a world that, embraced a poetic approach to prose. And that was something that I was really interested in with No Credit River.
I'm really glad that you mentioned as one of the sort of influences or similar works, The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, because that was one of the first things when I was reading No Credit River. I was like, it's giving me the Argonauts. I'm seeing a sort of relationship between these texts. Mm-hmm. And particularly when we're looking at the nature of the relationship that's being engaged with in the two texts, right? No Credit River is talking about this relationship between you, a femqueer woman, and a transmasculine person. And that's also what's going on in The Argonauts. And this is a sort of relationship that you've explored in other works that you've put out in the past in previous novels. What are some of the specific challenges or negotiations that you were wrestling with crafting this new book, given that it is this confessional type of work where you're talking about your own experiences in that kind of relationship?
While I was writing it, I was very conscious about how there's very few literary works about femme-butch relationships and very few about femme and transmasculine relationships. And the work that is there is always, I feel like there's something about queer audiences and queer readerships when we read work by people in our own communities, like our claws are out, we're ready to fight in a way. And it's like kind of dispiriting and terrifying as a writer. There's something scary about it in particular because the world, especially the world now, like really distrusts trans people and really on purpose misunderstands and hates trans people. And also the partners of trans people who are cis or who might be cis are considered also untrustworthy and somehow suspect. And so it was important to me while writing that I kind of acknowledge that and also free myself from that sort of self-censorship that can happen when we're trying to, I had to let go of any kind of ideas of representation and think only about the artful quality or the real sort of vulnerability that I wanted to get at through language. My editor on the book, Jacob Mooney, who was so great, at some point I felt like I shouldn't publish this. I was too scared. And he said, heartache is a universal experience. And he kind of gave me the freedom to actually go a level deeper than I had because of those fears.
Mm. We have been sort of talking about, a relationship that it wasn't just the breakup that was painful, but also there were a lot of painful things that happened within the context of this relationship. It was a relationship of more than 5 years. I'm wondering, to the extent that you're comfortable, can you tell us a bit more about it, just to give some context and grounding for some of what we've been discussing so far?
Sure. So the book came about because of a series of extraordinary events in my life that were sort of defining moments that happened leading up to the pandemic. After about a decades-long period of indecision about whether or not I wanted to have my own children, after I turned 40 in 2016, I became a step parent and moved in with my partner and his kids. And, it's sort of reaffirmed that I wasn't going to have kids. And then when he left me in a very sudden kind of way, right before the pandemic started, I was having to rethink that decision. And then I accidentally got pregnant when I was 43, which I thought was statistically possible. And I was also single for the first time in my adult life. And then I lost the baby.
A series of extraordinary events, I think, is the most sort of neutral way that I can describe that series of events.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a lot to sort of have happen in such a relatively short period of one's life, and then throwing in a global pandemic that upended everyone's life, regardless of what sorts of things were going on in the background. Speaking about your experience of having a miscarriage during the pandemic when you were 44, it's just like a heart-wrenching story, and one that a lot of people go through but choose to not discuss. What made you feel it was important to share that experience in particular? Because I know you also wrote an essay about it in The Cut much closer to the time that it happened compared to the sort of relative distance of No Credit River being published.
I wanted to write about the experience because it was so profound. And I think that I didn't realize what a miscarriage was. I didn't understand the physical pain and the grief component. I mean, I understood it, like, of course you understand what it is, but like it was early April of 2020 and people were afraid to go to the hospital. So, you know, I had my best friend came over and stayed with me, but I think if it would have been any other time, I would have gone to the hospital. It was a very frightening and calamitous, like dangerous experience. Yet when I was, you know, a few days later recovering, realized that it's actually so common because the more people I actually spoke to, the more people let me know that they had also experienced this particular loss. And it was strange and interesting. And I think I was almost unable to think about anything else. And I'm the kind of writer that if there's something that is preoccupying me, it's going to come out in my work. Even if I, you know, were to decide to write a sci-fi novel, I think, you know, the narrative, the authorial voice would come through in terms of whatever I'm thinking and reading about and experiencing.
Do you feel at all that there's like a tension or a collision between being queer, but then also have the like having this longing for motherhood, and specifically like it feels wanting to have a kid yourself? Like I find this really interesting just as someone who's a bit younger and isn't yet confronting this sort of like biological time clock crash that seems to be happening for some of your characters and also possibly for you.
Yes, like I feel like there's always a joke about what we used to make when I was probably your age around like queers being permitted an extended adolescence. A lot of my friends and I did not have the experiences most teenagers have until they came out. And then your 20s, you're allowed to still be a teenager. And then a lot of queer women my age have babies late because they've, you know, it's taken us longer to settle into our chosen families and to like figure out our lives. And now I think it's easier to come out and it's maybe easier to form family structures that are more traditional looking earlier. But I do think that what surprised me about growing older, and, you know, I'm 48, was just how much I started to think about this timeline that I think queers were sort of permitted to not have to think about. Like we didn't have to conform and stay on these kind of relationship escalators that were leading towards a certain kind of long-term monogamy that might be dysfunctional or heteronormative. And then, you know, when I reached 35, I was like, oh, I should start making these decisions. I should start thinking about my life in a different way. And that was surprising. It was surprising to me, like how there's a line in No Credit River about like how illegible a woman's body can be if you don't have a child, and how even amongst other queers, it starts to feel that way sometimes when everyone around you has kids.
I mean, people still make the joke about queer extended adolescence. That hasn't changed. I think perhaps the relationship escalator pressure, I will say, I think maybe is more acute now just because, first of all, the marriage debate was like settled when people my age were children, right? So the idea of like being able to access marriage, parenthood in Canada is seen as a given. But then it does mean that you get some of the same questions perhaps from family members of like, so TikTok, like when are you going to settle down?
Yes.
There's this sense throughout No Credit River when you're delving back into that 5-year relationship that there were things about it that didn't always sit well with you. There's this poem in particular called Red Flags where you're delving back into some of that. And I'm curious, do you have a sense of why it was that you felt you wanted to stay in this relationship even when there were signs it wasn't working? I think that that's something definitely I can relate to, the desire to stay in a bad situation and try and throw everything at the wall to fix it. I think probably a lot of our listeners can relate as well.
You know, there are a lot of mistakes that I made in that relationship that I would never repeat, and that I think that I've worked through in therapy, et cetera. I used to think of myself as someone in a positive way, of someone who was very loyal and who would stick relationships out and would try to be the fixer. And I think that there's some dishonesty in that role in a relationship. I think that there is a way that women often will, be so concerned with what somebody else wants that they'll try to morph into who that person is. And also, I was in lesbian relationships for 20 years. I don't think it's necessarily gendered, but I think it's sort of a light codependence where you kind of give up what you want in service of staying in a relationship, because we've been told all our lives that the most important thing is to not be alone and to be in a relationship, even if you're not getting what you need. And I think that I was certainly guilty of that through many relationships, some of which come up in the memoir as well. The book is a lot about what it's like to be in your 30s and early 40s and look around and think, this isn't what I thought my life was going to look like at this age. And I think that's particularly for queer people my age, a lot of us didn't really think about middle age, didn't think about aging. And so there's a lot of thought around that as well.
Zoe, I think there's this idea about how long you're supposed to grieve a breakup. There's all sorts of math that people will do of it's acceptable for this many months to be really upset. And then at a certain point, there seems to be a bit of a common understanding that you should move on, you should try and date around. Mm-hmm. But you were very open about the fact that 2 years out from this 5-year relationship, you were still really not okay. Of course, as you've mentioned, there were so many other things happening at the time in your life specifically and in the world that I think perhaps could have contributed to that. I'm wondering whether you find that in general, our culture is too dismissive of romantic loss. Like, do you think we need to collectively understand this as maybe a more impactful experience than we do understand it as?
I definitely think so. I think it feels like there's a culture of not admitting how profound that loss is, that romantic loss can be life-changing and altering, and it can really impact the next few years of your life. And I think that what was interesting and difficult about what I went through was that it really did feel like all the messages you get about heartbreak involve, you should just dust yourself off, pick yourself up, go back out there. And my experience of trying to quote unquote go back out there during that time was, it wasn't useful. And I think that part of the decision to write the book was also the fact that I was wrestling with just allowing myself to be alone and to really sink into the good parts of kind of leading a bit of a solitary life.
Mm. We've been talking about a lot of unbelievably heavy subjects through this conversation. You've done a lot of comedic writing. You've done stand-up. You have a little notebook that you sometimes write ideas down in. And there is some humor in some of this recent work, even as they're dealing with incredibly heavy topics, loss, anxiety, longing. I found particularly Wild Failure. There were times where I was sitting on my couch by myself, chuckling along.
Good.
How do you integrate humor into these stories that deal with the really just deep muck of being a person?
I think it's partially just my personality and how I think. I think I'm very attuned to irony. I think because I'm a character first kind of writer, and I think of plot almost never, as a lot of reviewers have noted. But because I'm a character first kind of writer, I think about what that character would find funny, and it's part of how I understand them. And in terms of myself, my own observations, I think because I have done comedy writing for 10 years now, it's also just part of my process. The line between comedy and tragedy, that famous line about it being all about timing. And I think that for comedy writers, that line is almost immediate. And so, there are some very dark, horrible experiences that I have gone through that I find humor in almost immediately, because it's a way of getting through it. And I think if I didn't have that, I don't know what I would do, maybe be more involved in some way. But yeah.
Yeah, The timing between comedy and tragedy thing, I really feel, because I think I am also a person where if something bad happens in my life and I can't laugh, it's a disaster. Like, you gotta figure out a way to laugh. I'll be writing an obituary and I'll be like, ho, like I gotta get a joke in there. Like, just
they would find this funny.
One thing to make it not so bleak for the reader. I think specifically finding humor in anxiety and kind of realizing the absurdity of one's own fears is something that came through for me, particularly with some of the characters in Wild Failure. The title story is about this recovering agoraphobic who she's outdoors with her nature-loving partner and is just convinced that everything outside is going to kill her. What was it about that situation in particular that you wanted to explore?
Well, the premise of that story is that there's a recovering agoraphobic in a desperate relationship, totally in love with a wilderness hiker. And that's a very funny premise to me. And I think that it's also a really interesting way to put two characters in peril. But I think, to me, anxiety disorder, as someone who's had anxiety disorder since I was 17 years old, it's very funny. Like, it's so dumb. Like, there's... Even when I'm in a very particular anxious state, which thankfully I don't experience that much anymore. But when I am, I have a number of very close friends who relate and who can find the humor in it with me. And it helps me to get through it. And I think there's no way to write about mental illness in a lot of ways besides finding the unique absurdity of it, because there is something absurd about being afraid to leave your house.
You've said before that you used to be too anxious to be alone for long stretches of time, but I know during the pandemic, not long after the end of the relationship that you talk about in No Credit River, not long after the miscarriage that you've talked about, you gave up your condo in Toronto and you bought this fixer-upper home in Prince Edward County where you now live by yourself. Very scary. Mm-hmm. What motivated this move and this pretty major life change?
Yeah, it's funny. I used to be, when my partner would go out of town, I would wake up all throughout the night and be convinced that somebody was breaking in. And then throughout the pandemic, living alone, I really started to enjoy it and to really feel solid in my solitary life. And so in 2021, when I was realizing that there was going to be another lockdown and I lived alone in this very overpriced apartment, and I felt that at any moment I was going to be evicted because it was Toronto, I started to fantasize and look at small town real estate. And it just sort of a series of things happened where it was suddenly possible. I found a mortgage broker that understood an artist, which is very difficult to find. A whole bunch of things happened so that I have this life now in a small town that I really enjoy. And I think that it's been really great for my writing.
Yeah.
Certainly.
I see your big, beautiful bookshelf in the background behind you. Built it. I mean, it looks built in. I don't know if it is or not.
It is.
That's
it
gorgeous.
Is built in. Yeah, it even has a ladder.
See, this is this is not good for radio as an audio medium. But yeah, very big built-in bookshelf that is tall enough to need a ladder, which is like a dream for me to have in a house. I have a very small built-in in my apartment, which is, I'm like an eighth of the way to what you've got going on. I'm wondering whether spending this time alone out in the country, kind of fending for yourself a little bit, but also having to build community in a new place and meet new people. You mentioned that it's been good for your writing, but I'm wondering if it's had an impact on how you think about relationships, whether that's romantic or just community relationships, and your role in them.
I think that in a smaller place, there's less of that Toronto frenzy where you feel like Toronto is such a workaholic city. And that's why I loved it for so long. You have to work so hard just to be able to pay rent there. And in a smaller town, you just sort of end up making slower connections. And there's sort of a pace of life that I really love. And it reminds me of my childhood where I grew up on a farm and I've been in cities for almost 30 years. And I felt like, this is actually the pace that I operate at in a kind of calm way. I felt like there were a lot of things about living in the city in terms of sensory overload that I just kind of dealt with for a really long time. And being able to sort of break away from that, I realized how much I actually am more attuned. My nervous system is more attuned to being in a smaller place. And then I'm having to make new friendships as a single person in your 40s is a really interesting kind of experiment, although I did know a lot of people who had moved here already. But, part of living here and having these kind of built-in shelves and that kind of thing is, it's about, like, I think for the longest time I thought, okay, my life is going to begin when I have a partner and we make these decisions together. And I had 2 long-term relationships where that did happen. But then finding myself single again, I thought I have to do these things on my own and kind of find this independence and inner strength that I didn't necessarily know that I had. And part of moving here and making this decision was realizing that I do have those strengths.
It's scary, I think, to make certain huge life-changing decisions by yourself, but also it can be so empowering.
Right.
There's this line in No Credit River that I really liked, talking about the plunge of getting into a new relationship, of falling in love. And you say, of course a poet likes to be in love. Intimacy is the only cliff jump I like. I'm wondering for you, if you do take the plunge and kind of commit yourself deeply to a relationship again, what do you think you might do the same and what do you think you might do differently?
That's a really interesting question. I think that I have broken a lot of patterns, and I think, I'm more of a slow, cautious, dip my feet in the water kind of person now. I have been in a relationship for 2 years, and it's been, long distance and a little bit slower. And there's been something nice about that because I think, I was part of the stereotype for many years of like the U-Haul lesbian where you jump in with both feet right away. And I think that there's something nice about being a little more cautious and like remembering the good things about independence and then taking that to a partnership.
Zoe, thank you so much. It's been a joy talking with you and getting to gaze upon your beautiful built-in bookshelf in your house.
Thank you, Mattea. It's been wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with Zoe Whittall, the author of No Credit River and Wild Failure. If you also would like to gaze upon Zoe's beautiful built-in bookcase, and you absolutely do, it is so gorgeous, you can head to CBC Books on TikTok and Instagram. And I have some exciting news to share in the world of Zoe Whittall. Zoe has just been named a juror for the 2025 CBC Nonfiction Prize. The other jurors are Danny Ramadan and Helen Knott. Submissions for the CBC Nonfiction Prize are open right now. The winner will receive $6,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts, a 2-week writing residency at the Banff Centre, and they'll have their work published on the CBC Books website. This episode was produced by Katie Swales. Our associate producer is Ailey Yamamoto, our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our hardworking audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team who make it all come together for us every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.